The candlelight trembled against the courthouse wall, its flame bending with each breath of wind that seeped through the cracked window panes. It was the autumn of 1898, the kind that settled on Kentucky like a secret, heavy, grey and waiting. The courthouse smelled of paper and whiskey, of dust disturbed by boots too clean to belong to working men, and there, beneath the portrait of a long-dead governor, sat Judge Alastair Wren, signing his name across a folded deed as if sealing a prayer. His pen scratched slow, steady lines through the silence, and when he paused to blot the ink, the candle's flicker revealed something hollow in his eyes, a man who'd begun to confuse righteousness with ownership. Outside, the fog clung to the courthouse steps like an audience that dared not leave. The cobblestones were slick from the morning's rain, and through it came the sound of a wagon wheel creaking, its horse's breath turning white in the cold. The courthouse clerk, a young man barely 20, stepped out to lock the doors. He glanced toward the edge of town, where the judge's new property stretched like a wound through the hills. Folk said that land used to belong to a widowed farmer, a quiet man, church-going, decent, who had died too early, leaving behind only a small cabin and a little girl who liked to collect hickory nuts by the creek. Her name was Clara Mae. She was 8 when her father died, and 10 when she was sent to the orphanage after the land changed hands. No one could quite say how that happened, except that papers had been found, witnessed, and sealed. Judge Wren's boots never touched the mud of the people he ruled. His world was made of leather, oak, and polished glass, not of soil or sweat. He built fences where laughter used to run, marked borders where childhood once wandered free. By day, he was the embodiment of order, his black coat pressed, his hat tipped to the ladies at market, his sermons about morality echoing across town halls. But by night, something in that fine posture seemed to bend. From the street, people could see the glow of his study windows, 1 candle, then 2, sometimes 3, burning past midnight. They said he was writing new laws, but the truth was quieter and less grand. He was reading old ones, searching them for the one line that would justify what he had done. In the evenings, when the church bell rang 6 times, the orphans were led back from their chores. Clara Mae was among them, her hair the color of autumn bark, her hands rough from scrubbing the same steps where the judge now placed his shoes. The matron told her not to speak of the past, that good children accepted what the Lord provided. But sometimes, while sweeping the chapel floor, Clara would pause by the cracked stained glass, the one that faced the hills, and whisper her father's name as if it might carry through the wind to where their farm had been. The pastor heard her once, and though he said nothing, he crossed himself afterward. The town wasn't cruel, just quiet. Quiet in the way people become when they sense that truth is dangerous. The shopkeeper, who once delivered milk to Clara's father, now sold the judge his cigars. The blacksmith who had shod the farmer's mule now mended the judge's horse bridle. Everyone told themselves the same thing, that it was better to survive the times than to question them. Still, at the post office, behind the murmurs of stamps and envelopes, someone whispered that the judge's claim had been forged. Another said they saw the widow's signature, written too cleanly, too steady for a hand that had trembled with fever days before her death. No one brought it to the courthouse. No one dared. The autumn deepened. The trees began to burn orange, at their edges, their roots darkening where the soil stayed damp. On Sundays, Judge Wren would walk the new fence line with a silver cane, tapping the posts as if listening for applause. From the ridge, he could see the orphanage spire catching the last light. He said once, to a fellow magistrate, that children should learn obedience before mercy, that discipline was the spine of civilization. His companion nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. At night, the judge's study grew thick with the smell of oil and ink. The desk was scattered with ledgers, deeds, and letters, folded so many times the creases had gone white. He kept the land deed in a drawer lined with green felt, beside a small portrait of his late wife. Sometimes he would take it out, look at her painted smile, and whisper as if confessing, "It had to be done." Then he'd look toward the window, where the fog outside pressed against the glass like a hand seeking entry. The scribe who lived across the square said the judge's lamps never went out. They only dimmed, flickered, then burned again, as if the light was being tested by something unseen. On one of those nights, the scribe noticed a strange pattern. Every few minutes, the candle in the left window would go dark, then flare up again, as if a shadow passed in front of it. He thought it might be the wind, but the fog was still that evening. The courthouse clock struck 2 before the lights finally died. By early December, frost rimmed the churchyard fence. The orphanage matron complained that the firewood pile had gone missing, though no one had touched it. Some of the children said they saw a figure walking near the grove beyond the judge's land, tall, with a coat that glimmered faintly under the moonlight. They said it stopped beside the creek where the hickories grew, where Clara once gathered nuts in her apron. The matron scolded them for speaking such things, but the next morning muddy boot prints led from the orphanage gate down toward that same grove, fading where the frost grew thick. The judge's mood turned restless. He grew curt in court, snapping at clerks, forgetting names he'd known for years. He was seen pacing the veranda of his home, gloved hands clasped behind his back, muttering about trespassers and thieves. The sheriff offered to investigate, but the judge refused, saying only, "The law defends itself." Yet he began to sense it, a heaviness in the air, a feeling that the land no longer recognized its new master. One evening, as he walked the fence alone, the wind picked up without warning. It came low and sharp, rattling the dry branches until they sounded like whispered laughter. His cane slipped on the frozen earth, and for a moment he felt something catch his sleeve. Not a branch, not a thorn, but something that held fast, as though the air itself resisted him. When he tore free, the fabric ripped clean to the seam. He turned, but there was nothing there, only the trees leaning ever so slightly toward him, their shapes blurred by the fog. That night, he didn't light his lamps. He sat in the dark, listening to the creaks of his house, the sigh of old timber, the drip of thawing frost, the faint patter of branches brushing the shutters. Somewhere in that rhythm, he thought he heard footsteps on the porch. He waited, heart hammering beneath his vest, until a single knock echoed through the door. When he opened it, the night was empty. Only the wind passed through, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and hickory leaves. The next morning, the maid found his study door ajar, papers strewn across the floor like fallen feathers. The ink pot had spilled, staining the edge of the deed black. When she tried to wipe it clean, the mark only spread, a dark bloom that wouldn't fade. The judge dismissed her for the day, but when she left, she saw him kneeling by the fireplace, feeding the documents one by one into the flames. She said his face looked older, the lines deeper, his eyes rimmed with red, as if he hadn't slept in days. Winter came fast that year. The fields froze before the last harvest, and the creek turned to glass beneath the hickories. At night, the frost on the windows of the judge's house formed strange shapes, not random frostwork, but patterns that looked almost like writing. No one dared mention it to him, but the servants whispered, "The orphan's land is writing back." By the first frost, even the courthouse gossips fell silent. They said the judge had changed, that his voice now carried a tremor, that he spoke less of law and more of divine punishment. And when he finally stood at the church pulpit one Sunday, his sermon stumbled midway through. He looked out at the congregation, men and women who'd once applauded him, and for a moment his mouth opened without sound. The candle beside him flickered, and he whispered almost to himself, "That land wasn't mine." Outside, the bells tolled noon, though the sky remained grey, and in the grove beyond the fields the trees stood waiting, their branches bare, their shadows long. Some swore they had begun to lean toward the judge's house, as if the earth itself had remembered what it had lost. The silver cutlery clinked softly against the judge's plate, a delicate rhythm that masked the unease spreading through his house. The chandelier above cast a golden pool across the dining table, but its light felt brittle, fragile, like it might shatter under the weight of the silence that lingered between courses. Judge Alastair Wren dined often with the county's finest, landowners, lawyers, men who measured worth in acres and influence. They raised their glasses to progress and prosperity, yet every toast carried the faint echo of something darker. The wine was rich, the laughter rehearsed, and the wood that panelled the judge's walls, oak and hickory, once part of the orphan's land, creaked as though straining to remember where it had grown. Injustice here did not roar, it whispered. It moved through folded documents, through a clerk's steady hand copying names that no longer belonged. The judge called it due process. He spoke of law as though it were scripture, his words slow and certain, as if heaven itself had appointed him to decide who deserved mercy and who did not. To him, compassion was weakness, and weakness was sin. He preached this creed in courtrooms and parlors, his voice echoing under chandeliers bought with other men's hunger. Yet beneath that marble voice lay a secret so old it had started to rot. The orphan's name, Clara Mae, faded from every record like ink dissolving in rain. The church ledger once held her baptism, but the page had been torn. The orphanage rolls listed only her initials, faint pencil marks rubbed nearly clean. Even her mother's grave, a simple wooden cross by the creek, was gone, ploughed under to make room for the judge's new rose. Gardened us in each petal that bloomed there drew its color, from the same soil that had once held the widow's bones. The servants whispered prayers when trimming the thorns. They said the roses bled more than they should, that their scent was too heavy like rust. The judge never noticed, or perhaps he did, and chose not to. He was a man of structure, of laws, ledgers, and schedules. Every morning he stood before his mirror, adjusting his collar, brushing the last trace of sleep from his eyes, until he could no longer recognize the man beneath the reflection. He had come to believe his own myth, that justice was his to shape, that the world owed him its obedience. But the nights were different. In the quiet after supper, when the fire sank low and the walls clicked with the cold, something inside him began to stir. His house had grown too still. Even the clocks ticked slower, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Then came the letters. The first arrived on a grey morning, tucked between court summons and tax receipts. The paper was rough, creased, the writing uneven. There was no name, no address, only a single line written in brown ink. The roots remember. The judge frowned, folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. By evening, he had forgotten it. But a week later another came. This one smelled faintly of iron and rain. Its edges were smeared red, as though the writer's fingers had bled through the paper. Again, the same line, the roots remember. He burned it, but the ash refused to scatter. The third letter arrived in winter. The seal was broken when it reached his hand. The paper was damp, heavy and cold as if it had been buried before it was sent. When he opened it, a small fragment of bark fell onto the desk. He stared at it for a long time, his breath slow, uneven. For the first time, Judge Wren felt something foreign to him, fear, quiet and unreasoned, like a memory he hadn't lived. That night, he drank more than usual. The sound of the wind outside grew strange, twisting through the chimneys in voices he almost recognized. The roses in the garden rattled softly against the window glass. He told himself it was nothing, just branches, just weather. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Clara Mae standing at the edge of the grove, her small hands folded in front of her, her eyes dark and still as the soil. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. When spring came, he ordered the grove cleared. He wanted a hunting lodge, something new, civilized, clean. He told the workers that the trees were old and dying, that their shade choked the grass. But when the men arrived with their axes, the forest felt alive. The air was thick and cool, the ground soft beneath their boots. The first swing never landed. One man dropped his tool and walked away, saying nothing. Another swore he saw movement among the trunks, a small figure watching. Silent as breath in winter, they left their tools where they fell. None of them returned the next day. The judge raged. He called them cowards, threatened arrest, but inside a deeper anger began to burn, not at the men, but at the land itself. The grove stood untouched, defiant, and at its heart was the hickory tree where Clara had once gathered her nuts. Its bark had darkened, scarred by time, but it still leaned toward the creek, the way it had when she played there. The judge stood before it, his cane pressing deep into the mud. He spoke to it, though no one heard. He said the words as though addressing a person, "You belong to me now." The wind answered with a long, low groan, bending the branches until they nearly touched the earth. By dusk, he returned home, mud on his boots, his temper cracked. He called for whiskey, but his hand shook when he poured it. The house was too quiet again. Even the servants seemed to move slower. Their eyes lowered. He felt the floorboards beneath him, how they creaked, how they sighed when he walked. As though remembering the weight of something buried, he thought of the letters and the phrase that would not leave him, "The roots remember." He said it aloud, mocking it at first, then whispering it softer, until the words lost their meaning and became just sound. When midnight came, his horse began to neigh from the stable, sharp and panicked. He heard the sound through the glass, the hooves striking wood, the rope snapping against the post. He rushed outside, coat half buttoned, the cold cutting into his chest. The moon was high, the fields glimmering pale. The stable door hung open. Inside, the lantern had fallen, its flame licking the straw. The horse was gone, only the reins remained, torn and tangled. He followed the trail through the fog, past the edge of the garden, down toward the grove. Each step sank deeper into the wet earth. Somewhere in the darkness, branches moved though there was no wind. His breath came short, his boots heavy. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. The grove stood silent, the hickory trees still, their limbs stretching like ribs over the ground. In the center, the horse's saddle lay overturned, one strap torn, the rest coated in mud. The animal was nowhere. Only hoofprints led in a circle, then vanished into the roots. He waited there for a long time, the fog rising around him. The air smelled of moss and rust. He thought he heard footsteps again, soft, deliberate, coming from behind him. He turned, but there was nothing, only the trees closer now than before, their trunks leaning ever so slightly toward him. His heart pounded. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then came a sound, a whisper, almost too low to catch. It might have been the wind, or it might have been a child's voice. He ran. By dawn, his boots were streaked with mud, his coat torn at the sleeve. He told the servants the horse had bolted, that it would be found by morning. But the next day, when the animal returned to town, it came without a rider. Its reins dragged through the dirt. Its saddle was split. The townspeople found it near the courthouse steps, shivering, its eyes wide as if it had seen something it couldn't name. When they brought the horse back to him, the judge said nothing. He only touched the torn leather, then turned away. That night, the letters in his desk caught fire on their own. The servants saw the smoke under the study door. But when they burst in, the flames had already died. Only ash remained, drifting across the desk like grey snow. And still, the grove stood, the trees untouched, the roots remembering. The judge stopped speaking of hunting lodges after that. He spent his evenings alone, the lamps dimmed, the curtains drawn, sometimes from the road. Travellers said they saw him standing at his window, looking toward the hills. They said he stood there for hours, unmoving, as if waiting for the land to forgive him. But land does not forgive, it remembers always. And when the moon rose again, the wind through the trees carried a sound, soft, rhythmic, like the rustle of a dress against fallen leaves. Something was walking there, something that had been waiting a very long time. The house stood silent. The clock ticked once, then stopped, and somewhere beyond the field, the hickories leaned a little closer to the house. The first rain of spring came without warning, soft and steady, washing the dust from the courthouse steps and seeping into the cracks of the old town road. It carried with it a strange stillness, the kind that made even the crickets quiet their song. Weeks had passed since Judge Alastair Wren disappeared, and though his absence should have been a scandal, the people spoke of it in hushed tones, like a secret they had all agreed to keep. His house stood dark, the shutters closed, the roses in the garden overgrown and crawling up the porch rails. No one dared step inside. The servants had left within days, crossing themselves as they walked away. Only the echo of the judge's boots remained in memory, sharp, measured, and now mercifully gone. The forest that bordered his estate had grown strange. Travellers said the air there tasted metallic, like iron and rain. The trees leaned inward, their branches tangled, the ground beneath them soft and uneven as if it had been disturbed. When the wind moved through, it carried no birdsong, only the faint rhythmic groan of wood shifting against wood. Some said the sound resembled breathing, others said it was something older. By the time the sheriff finally gathered a search party, Even he hesitated at the forest's edge. The men carried lanterns that flickered weakly against the mist. The light barely touched the path ahead. It was the deputy who first saw the coat. It hung low on a gnarled hickory, the fabric dark and heavy with rain. The sleeve was torn, and the buttons had been pulled loose as though by desperate hands. Beneath it, half buried in the roots, they found him. The judge's body was sunken deep into the earth, his chest pressed against the base of the tree, as if the ground itself had drawn him in. His watch had stopped at 2:17. The chain lay snapped beside him, a glint of silver dull beneath the mud. When they pulled him free, the root seemed reluctant to let go, coiling around his legs, breaking only with effort. The men stepped back, silent, their breaths fogging in the damp air. His hands told the story better than any report. The fingers were curled tight, packed with soil that reached deep beneath the nails. It looked as though he had tried to claw his way out. His face, pale and slack, bore no wound, only the faint streaks of dirt that traced from his temples to his jaw. Someone whispered that he looked as though he'd been listening to the ground. They covered him with a tarp, but the rain kept soaking through, blurring the line between body and earth. As they lifted him onto the cart, something caught the deputy's eye, a small glimmer where the judge's weight had been. He reached down and brushed aside the mud. There, half buried, was a locket, rusted oval, its hinge corroded with time. When he opened it, the inside was lined with a scrap of faded blue cloth and a set of initials, barely visible beneath the rust. CM. The deputy froze. He knew those letters. Everyone in town did. Clara Mae, the orphan child whose land had made the judge rich. No one spoke for a long while. The sheriff cleared his throat, told them to keep moving, and motioned to cover the locket. But the deputy slipped it into his pocket instead. He said later that he couldn't help himself, that it felt wrong to leave it there, wrong to let the earth take it again. Yet as they walked out of the forest, he swore he heard whispers in the leaves, faint and rhythmic, like breath passing through wood. Another man said he saw something at the edge of the path, a figure small and pale standing between the trees. The rain obscured it, but he could make out the outline of a girl, her hair drifting like smoke, her eyes pale as candle flame. When he blinked, she was gone. The judge's body was taken to the chapel on the hill. No preacher would speak his name. They buried him behind the churchyard wall, away from the rest, where the soil turned dark and thick with roots. The townsfolk gathered not from pity but from fear. Some came to see if it was true, if the man who had once ruled them could be claimed by the same ground he'd stolen. The sheriff said a few words about justice and consequence, his voice shaking slightly as he read from the Book of Psalms. The deputy stood apart, hand in his pocket, feeling the cold shape of the locket pressing against his palm. When the coffin was lowered, the wind shifted and every candle inside the chapel guttered at once. Afterward, the town tried to move on. The courthouse reopened under a new magistrate, though the wooden chair the judge had once sat in remained empty for weeks before anyone dared occupy it. His mansion stood quiet, the shutters nailed shut. The rose garden withered, the petals turning black, the thorns growing long enough to snag a man's sleeve if he passed too close. No one cleared it. The servants who had fled refused to return. They said at night the house still glowed faintly from within, as if a candle burned in the judge's study, though no one could see who had lit it. The grove remained untouched. Not a single tree was cut, not a single branch burned for firewood. Farmers gave it a wide berth. Even cattle refused to graze near its edge. The air there stayed cool even in summer, and the grass grew sparse. A few boys dared one another to enter, but each came back pale, unable or unwilling to say what they had seen. One said he heard singing. Another said he saw small footprints in the mud beside his own. Years slipped by like pages in a book. The story of the judge became part of the town's whispered history, softened by time but never forgotten. The deputy who had found him grew old, his hands stiff and his hair white. Before he died, he passed the locket to his daughter, warning her never to wear it, never to bury it. She kept it in a small wooden box on her dresser. Sometimes when the wind came down from the hills, the box would rattle faintly, though the lid stayed closed. Hunters who wandered too close to the grove told their own stories. They said their dogs refused to cross its edge, tails low, eyes fixed on the ground. One man claimed that when he tried to force his hound forward, it yelped and bolted, tearing the leash from his hand. He followed the trail to the creek, but the animal was gone. Only its prints remained, circling back toward town. When he returned the next morning, the prints had filled with water, as if the land had swallowed them. The locals began to call it the land that judges back. Some said it was cursed, others said it was holy in its own strange way, a place where the earth itself held memory, where roots tangled with the sins of men. On still nights they claimed you could hear faint knocking from beneath the soil, soft, deliberate like fingers against wood. The preacher called it nonsense, but even he avoided the grove after sundown. Decades later, when the town expanded and new roads were planned, surveyors came with their maps and measuring tools. They stood at the grove's edge, calculating where to cut. But their instruments failed. Compasses spun, levels tilted, the air too heavy to breathe for long. They abandoned the project before noon. The new road curved around the grove, a silent detour no one questioned, and so the land remained as it was. The trees grew taller, their bark thick and dark, their roots deep and tangled. Every storm that passed left the ground undisturbed, as though even nature bowed to what rested there. The judge's mansion collapsed in time, its roof caving inward, its walls softened by ivy and rot. Yet the grove stood firm, untouched by decay. Sometimes, in the dying light of evening, when mist crept through the fields, a faint figure could still be seen near the edge of the trees, a small shape motionless facing the town. The air around her seemed to hum, the way a hymn does when sung too quietly to hear the words. The people no longer spoke her name, but they knew who she was. Clara Mae, the orphan who had lost her home, her family, her place in the world, until the world remembered her for her. The roots remembered too, and though the years took the faces of those who had known the truth, the land kept its witness. It waited in silence, season after season, beneath the same grey Kentucky sky. When the wind passed through the grove, the trees swayed together, slow and solemn, their branches bending low as if bowing in mourning, or perhaps in judgment. Even now, when the church bell rings on Sundays, the sound carries longer across that stretch of earth. It echoes once, then twice, before fading into a hush that feels too complete. Those who hear it say it's only the hills answering back, but the old ones, the ones who remember what was buried there, know better. They touch the soil, cross themselves, and whisper softly, "Some names never rest, and some land never forgets." The mansion had become a skeleton of itself, its bones wrapped in ivy, and its breath replaced by silence. The windows that once reflected candlelight now stared blankly at the hills, clouded and hollow, while dust gathered in the corners, like old secrets refusing to fade. Every gust of wind made the shutters sigh, a slow, tired sound that carried through the empty halls and across the grounds where grass had overtaken the gravel paths. The judge's house, once a symbol of order and power, now stood like a monument to decay, the law gone quiet, the books still open but unread, their pages curling with damp and neglect. When it rained, water slipped through the cracks in the ceiling and ran down the portraits of long-dead faces, streaking the varnish until the eyes looked like they were weeping. No one lived there anymore. No one dared. By then, decades had passed, since Judge Alastair Wren's body had been found in the grove. The town had changed, but not entirely. Electric lights flickered where lamps once burned, and the courthouse clock still tolled noon across the square. Yet the land that had made the judge's name, the orphan's land, remained untouched. The fields grew wild with thistle and vine, the soil too dense to plough, the air around it still colder than the rest of the valley. Hunters avoided it, horses refused to cross its edge, and on some nights, when the fog rolled low, the grove seemed to hum, a deep, mournful sound like a hymn sung beneath the ground. Children whispered about it as they walked home from school, daring each other to step beyond the fence. None did. They said it wasn't just haunted, it was awake. In the county's archive, where dust lay thick on every shelf and time moved, slower than the rest of the world, a young intern once found a letter. It was folded within a cracked envelope, tucked inside a file marked, "Last Will and Testament of Judge A. Wren." The ink had bled faintly through the page, but the words were still legible, trembling as if written by an unsteady hand. The letter wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The same bold script that had once signed land deeds and verdicts. It read, "I took what wasn't mine, The land does not forgive, nor should it. The intern held it for a long moment, unsure if what she felt was pity or dread. She showed it to her supervisor, who shook his head, told her to refile it, and said quietly, "Best not to stir the ground that's settled." But she couldn't forget the weight of that sentence, how the ink seemed to sink deeper into the paper, as though trying to bury itself. Over time, the judge's story blurred into folklore. The official record spoke of an accidental death, a tragic fall or heart failure, depending on which clerk one asked. But the people never forgot the whispers, how the judge who took the orphan's land was taken by it in return. They said that when he was found, the earth had pulled him close, as if claiming its due. They said that his watch stopped at 2:17, began ticking again for a single second when the coffin touched the soil. No one proved it. No one tried. The mansion, for all its grandeur, became part of the legend too. Travelers who passed by claimed they saw a single light glowing in an upper window, faint and golden, long after the house was empty. Some said it was the judge, still pacing his study, searching the ledgers for absolution he never earned. Others said it was the orphan, Clara Mae, standing by the window, watching the land that had once been hers. Either way, the light always vanished when the clock struck midnight, leaving the fields in silence again. The townsfolk tried to move on. They built new homes closer to the river, away from the grove and the mansion's shadow. The church replaced its bell, though the old one still hung in the belfry, cracked through its center. When it rang, the sound faltered, as if the air itself resisted the note. On certain anniversaries, no one remembered exactly which ones, the bell would toll once at dusk unbidden. The pastor would insist it was wind. The elders would only nod, their faces pale. Years turned into generations. The story passed from old voices to young ones, changing in detail but never in truth. Parents warned their children not to wander near the grove. Teachers spoke softly of the judge who forgot mercy, and at night, by lamplight, when the air was still and the crickets paused between songs, the oldest among them would tell it like a prayer. They said that the earth has memory, that it carries the shape of every footstep, every act of cruelty, every word unsaid, and that sometimes, when justice fails in life, the soil remembers in death. One summer evening, long after the mansion had collapsed into ruin, a group of boys ventured near the grove with flashlights and a dare. They found the stones of the judge's veranda swallowed by moss, the front door lying flat like a broken jaw. Inside, the air smelled of rain and rust. The books were gone, the shelves empty, but on the mantel above the fireplace, something small remained, a brass key, green with tarnish. One boy reached for it, but before his fingers touched metal, a sound broke the silence, a slow creak like the turning of a door hinge deep within the house. They ran, dropping the light, their footsteps vanishing into the tall grass. When they told the story later, they swore they heard a voice behind them, low and measured like a man reciting law from memory. No one went back. The house sank deeper into itself that year, the roof collapsing under the weight of ivy. The grove behind it thickened, the trees growing so dense that light no longer reached the ground. And yet the hum remained, soft, steady, almost musical. The farmers who passed nearby said it sounded like a choir too far to see, too low to name. Some said it was the wind. Others said it was the land remembering its own. By the mid-20th century, few people even recalled the judge's full name. His portrait in the courthouse had been removed, the frame stored in a basement where mildew ate away at the canvas. The records of the orphanage were lost in a fire. Clara Mae's grave was never found, yet the story endured because the land endured. The ground where it happened still refused to yield. The grass there stayed thin, and even in heavy rain the soil never turned to mud. It was as if the earth itself resisted being disturbed again. One spring morning, the county finally sent a surveyor to mark the area for a new road. He returned before noon, pale and shaken, insisting that the ground was unsound. He said the compass spun in his hand and that the air smelled like iron. When they asked what he saw, he said nothing, only that he heard someone humming an old church tune in the trees. The project was quietly cancelled. The files were marked unsuitable terrain. In the years that followed, people stopped talking about curses. They called it folklore or local superstition. But when storms passed through the valley, lightning never struck the grove. It split every hill and fence around it, yet always avoided that patch of land. On the rare occasion someone wandered too close, they described a feeling, not fear exactly, but something like guilt, as though stepping there meant being seen by something that could not forget. Eventually the mansion fell entirely. Only the foundation stones remained, half swallowed by the ground. Wildflowers grew through the cracks, and the hickories leaned low over the ruins, their roots twisting deep beneath the surface. When the wind blew through them, the sound was almost like words, not quite speech, but near enough that one might imagine it saying, "I remember." The intern who had found the judge's confession grew old herself. Before she retired, she placed the letter in a display case in the county museum, beside an unlabeled photograph of the grove. Few visitors noticed it. Those who did often paused, reading the single line twice, as if trying to understand what it cost to write. "I took what wasn't mine. The land does not forgive, nor should it." Some nights when the museum closed and the lights dimmed, the glass over that case would fog slightly, though the room remained dry. The curator blamed temperature changes. But once he swore he heard a faint tapping from inside, rhythmic and patient, like fingers against wood waiting to be let out. Time has a way of smoothing the edges of even the sharpest truths, but this one stayed. The judge's story became part of the soil, a lesson whispered through generations not by mouths but by wind and rain and roots. The land still breathes there, and when it does, it carries the echo of a man who learned too late that nothing truly belongs to those who take without mercy. And so, when the church bell rings across that valley, its tone seems to change just as the wind passes over the grove. It deepens, softens, and fades into a silence that feels deliberate, a pause held in memory of something older than the town itself. The people may forget the name, but the earth never does, because some names only find peace when the truth is told.